All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are back for another Bokeh Podcast episode. And in the close to 500 episodes that we've done, one of the few return guests that we've had on the show, it is my privilege to have my friend Gustavo Fernandez back on the show. Thanks for hanging out with me, man.
Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, always an honor and always a lot of fun to talk to you. So looking forward to it.
We've had some wide-ranging conversations over the years, and I was actually just talking to my girlfriend about you just the other day, and I've told her about you before, but just kind of reiterating the wonderful conversation that's ultimately that you are. But not only that, you have a certain intellectual capacity as well to go along with that I guess just furthers the quality of the conversation. I become quite enamored with our conversations, and certainly not because of my involvement.
Well, I'm always super curious. So
yeah.
I love learning, and I love asking questions, and I love sharing. So yeah, it's always a pleasure.
Well, and I also appreciate the fact that, and I maybe mentioned this in the podcast at some point in the past, but you were listening to the show a little while back, and you pushed me. You're like, you know what? Go a little bit deeper. Like, take the questions, follow the questions, and go a little bit deeper. Don't be hesitant to take a little bit of time with the show. And honestly, that was a catalyst for us going from, I think, it was attempting to do like 40-minute, 45-minute shows at the time, and now we regularly put out hour-long episodes. And I appreciate the encouragement to go deeper in conversation too.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, that's when you learn more. That's when, you got to go past that uncomfortable level of that question you typically don't ask someone. But that's usually where you're going to learn the most, which is always a lot of fun.
Yeah. At the same time, finding a balance there, because I know that in person, I'm having one-on-one conversation with somebody. I don't mind going there as much. In fact, to the extent that I think in some cases I've probably made people a little bit uncomfortable in the past because they're not used to somebody taking genuine interest and asking deeper questions than how was your day or what do you do for work. Is there, from your perspective, whether it's a conversation with clients or friends or otherwise, is there a line? Is there a balance to be had between going deep but then also being a bit aware of the person's comfortability?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of ways you can spin that, right? Like, what's the tone of the questions? How is that conversation happening? Whereas, is the client comfortable? Are you grilling them about certain things? Or do you have a ton of call to actions on whatever communication you might have? So, for me, at the end of the day, I just want to keep it personal and keep it fun, keep it simple. And for me, I just want to learn as much as I can about the client. And that way I'm able to share some of my experiences with them. When I know more, I'm able to kind of help them out more. So for me, it's like, how can I be memorable in their eyes and how can I make them successful?
Well, and this is a beautiful segue really to our conversation we're going to get to in just a few minutes today about how to create a better monthly newsletter. You talk about the personal element of connection and of any newsletter, really, that I've read in the last probably number of years. Your newsletter has such a beautifully personal slant to it. And I thought, it'd be really great if we had a conversation with and share that conversation with our listeners about how you've developed this newsletter to carry the voice that it does. Because I think we could all stand to add more of a personal slant to communication with clients or potential clients. So we're going to get to the details of that here in just a second. But for everybody listening in case you didn't hear my first conversation with Gustavo here on the podcast, if you go back to episode 275, we talked about building a recurring business model, and you can also get to know Gustavo a little bit more. Some of the introductory questions I normally ask in the podcast, you can hear in that episode as well. We'll link to that in the show notes at bokehpodcast.com. But Gustavo, today, one of the questions that I didn't get to ask the first time has to do more generally with customer experience. We're going to talk about customer experience as it relates to newsletters in a second, but on kind of a bigger picture level, is there a key idea that has driven your effort at building a good customer experience with your clients?
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, I mentioned it briefly a second ago, but being memorable, that's the number one thing. How can you be more memorable to your client or to that person you're creating that relationship with? Number one thing also is putting yourself in your client's shoes. How can you make them successful? It's going to open you up to so much more when you're kind of putting yourself in their shoes. What are their needs? What are their goals? How can you make their life easier? For example, I mean, I just recently moved into a new apartment, and my real estate agent experience, I was like, how can she make this experience better? there's a lot of missed out opportunities. You know, I moved in and I'm like, okay, how do I connect to cable? How do I connect to electricity? Who is the electricity provider? Who is the cable provider?
Yeah.
You know, what are the favorite spots around here? You know, what's the local map? What's this area look like? Where do I find a cleaning lady? When a client has way more questions than answers, I think there's a disconnect. So I think, you know, if by providing that service, by providing, you know, by putting yourself in that client's shoes, you can provide that information. It's like, hey, here's your keys. Here's a local map. Here's my favorite eating spots. Here's my favorite spot for coffee, my favorite lunch spot. Here's my favorite dish at these couple places. Oh, and by the way, most common cable provider is Comcast. This is how you sign up. The electricity provider is so-and-so. It's pretty easy. Just go to this website. And by the way, here's a couple of cleaning lady, maybe contact information. You know, once you're all settled in and need a deep clean, that way get your apartment going. It's just so many opportunities that she could have created a very memorable experience that she dropped the ball. So number one, putting yourself in your client's shoes and, you know, how can you be more memorable by doing that?
Oh, okay. That you summed that up beautifully, because I'm taking notes here. For those of our listeners, especially that have been listening for a long time, you know that I'm a bit of a digital technology freak. I'm not so much for the paper, except when it comes to taking notes of the podcast. So I've got there's actually a brand of pen that I've begun using that I really enjoy. It's called Zebra. Have you heard of the Zebra pens before, Gustavo?
I haven't, no, but I'm definitely a pen junkie.
Are you really? Okay, I mean, there's nothing fancy about this, but the weight of it is perfect. It writes consistently. I really enjoy it. We'll find it and link to it in the show notes to it, the podcast, bokehpodcast.com. Nonetheless, I'm taking notes here, and I wrote down be memorable and how can you make your client more successful is kind of the shorthand. And I like that can be kind of one and the same. If you're being empathetic, if you're putting yourself in the client's shoes, it enables you to be memorable because it's not necessarily commonplace. There are opportunities for us to make our clients' lives easier if we are being empathetic. Why do you think it is that a lot of companies don't do that? Is it just because it takes the extra bit of effort?
You know, that's a good question. You know, a lot of companies, or even if we talked a lot about the photography industry, right? You know, they don't necessarily have that mindset. You know, a lot of them are more artists, kind of more maybe introvert, you know, don't necessarily think that way in a sense, you know, haven't been educated in business. So, you know, they're not necessarily, that's kind of not their first inkling. Okay. Going back to, you know, one of the most probably recommended books and How to Win Friends and Influence People in your library there. Yep. It's, you know, that's one of the basic tenets is, you know, basically taking care of that client. So, I mean, it's a simple thing and it's not that much work and it doesn't take much to, I think, change your mindset to kind of think about it that way. You know, it's the perfect example of, for example, at an event, I'm usually helping some of the, you know, guests like, oh, here's where the restroom is, or here's where this is, because I am part of the event. You know, I'm not just taking the photos, or I'm not just doing, you know, headshots for the clients. I'm just also part of the overall experience of the event. And how do I kind of make sure that experience for that client is a memorable experience? You know, that event planner can't be everywhere at the same time. So they're not going to see that, you know, napkin on the floor that's in the middle of the hallway and it's not looking great. It's not my job to pick that up, you know, but I can always blame the catering department for making a mess, but it's going to take me half a second to bend over, pick that up, make sure that everything looks good, make sure that the client looks good. And overall, everybody has a great experience.
And I like that notion of taking responsibility first. It's super easy to kind of point the fingers the other direction. But I think asking, and this is something certainly I've been trying to do more consistently as a kind of multi-business owner, ask the question, how could we have approached that differently? You know, if a client, for example, of Photographers Edit gets frustrated with their experience, and, you know, working with thousands of photographers, obviously this is going to happen from time to time. The question that I would have, especially now, with now 13 years in, is there something that we could have done differently? Could we have managed expectations more clearly? Could we have communicated more clearly on the website and on the ordering page? Was the user experience frustrating when they went to upload the images? Can we refine that process? Is there anything that we could have done to make it more user-friendly? Because my understanding anyway of user or customer experience is that if it's easy, then they're naturally going to be happier. If they're frustrated along the way because it's complicated in one form or another, expectations aren't managed, and the user experience is frustrating. then we're off to a bad start. And if they get the images back and, maybe they're 95% of the way there, they're less likely to be patient in that case to get the remaining 5% refined than somebody who is, ultimately has been through a frustrating experience. So I know that there's going to be more patience there if I've done my job on the front end, which enables us to be able to build a more long-term relationship. But we have to be willing to go that extra mile and take responsibility for that. I love that you highlight that.
Well, it's interesting because all I heard you say was technical. And all I wanted to say was personal, right?
That's funny.
So it's, two things. One, the power of a phone call. And two, it's my parents' generation, right? All I hear them complain about when they have a bad customer experience go, gosh, they don't even have a phone number anymore. I can't call them.
Yeah.
Right. But it's that power of a phone call or a voicemail or, even a video message, right? Like we've talked about Loom a lot. I'm sending my clients a lot of messages where they're visually seeing my face. They're visually seeing my intonation. They're getting that clear message across. Whereas, as you know, a lot of times a text or an email can come off a different way. But when you're visually seeing, this message go over video, if you can't hop on the phone, it sets a different tone. So yeah, it's just funny how you went technical and I went personal, and I just go, hey, pick up the phone and make that call, because you're not gonna get a better connection and solve something quicker than a quick phone call.
Well, and just a little side note for everybody listening in, if you're not familiar with Loom, if you just go to loom.com, you'll learn what Gustavo is talking about here. But I think the reason I bring up the technical is because I'm thinking about the end user experience. Can I refine the technical portion of the user experience so that they are less frustrated in the end? Do you think that at the end of the day, like that we should have just started with a conversation to begin with? When you talk about technical versus personal, especially in that context, what are you thinking?
No, I was just thinking of those problem clients mainly. I wasn't thinking of let's get rid of the technical.
Okay.
Because there is a beautiful thing about an easy process on being able to sign up or order something, right? The less amount of clicks, the better, the best amount of information, the least amount of, away. How can we share that, right? So creating a seamless experience, of course, that's number one. But I was kind of more leaning towards like when somebody is frustrated, when somebody doesn't fit into that bucket that, maybe they're not computer savvy, maybe they just don't know, they're just not good on computers, right? We have a lot of artists out there that are not necessarily great with the technical. And how do you kind of observe those clients?
Well, I think that's a good reminder for all of us. It's a funny thing as a company gets larger, the challenge of balancing the personal with scale is it can be really tough. We've struggled with this over the years. Do we put the phone number on the front of the site, the very top of the page, so that is literally the first thing that you see? There's a tendency in that case for people to just, without even thinking, just picking up the phone and calling, which is wonderful in and of itself. If I had the budget to have a phone bank with a bunch of people just answering phone calls. So we've tried to find a balance in that we still make a phone number available, but it's on the support site along with the information that they're likely looking for anyway. In addition to, of course, a ticket system if they just want to send a message through, or they can email directly. I think we've come up with a pretty good balance. Your points are well taken. It's a good reminder for all of us to make things as personal as possible. But that really is a great segue into our kind of main focus and conversation today, which has to do with your newsletter. And as I had said earlier, I'm super impressed with this, largely because of the extremely personal nature of it. And people talk about being authentic. That's a word that's thrown around to an annoying extent these days. But I feel like you've legitimately put yourself out there with your newsletter, super, super intimate. And I just want to kind of dig into how you've done this, because I think we could all stand to add some of this to our communication with our clients. But before we get into it, we just talk a little bit about why you even send out a newsletter at all, any kind of newsletter. What are the main goals behind that?
Yeah, sure. For me and for my client base, I think email is still king, even in a super connected world of social media and, all the different channels of the Instagrams and the Facebooks and now the Clubhouse and whatnot, right? My typical client is behind a computer all day. They're not necessarily on any of the social channels. So for me, email is the best way to be top of mind with my clients. So, number one, it's just to keep building that relationship with my client. Most of them are hiring me for 1 to 2 large projects a year. And this allows me to kind of connect with them while we're not working together. So kind of fill in that gap of that in between. So then we do see each other and we do catch up. They're kind of up to date. And that's the super fun part, is when I do see some of my friends or some of my clients or just some of the colleagues that are reading my newsletter, like the first thing that comes out of their mouth is like, oh my God, so-and-so. And I read about your thing, and they're pretty much all caught up.
Okay.
So it's always fun to kind of start that conversation sort of already fresh, and they're going to ask those deeper questions, and always nice to kind of have that communication going already. Number two, it just reminds them of what I do. It's sharing some of the ideas of new things I might be putting out there. Like, I mentioned like the headshot station one time, which is kind of for volume headshots at events, or just reminding them to refer me to another client. It's like, oh, you know what? So-and-so asked me about this. Hey, I just got Gustavo's newsletter. Hey, let me refer Gustavo to that friend of mine or to that other company. And kind of lastly, it's for me. It's always fun looking back every month. I do everything in a month behind, right? So this month is going to be probably actually this week I'm writing it, and it'll be last month's kind of recap. So every month is a recap of the previous month. So it's always fun to look back to see everything I've done or haven't done, and what's happened in my life. I mean, I can barely remember what I did this morning. So
same.
So it's always cool. And, it's actually a pretty simple process. I mean, I go through like my Google Photos, for the last month, kind of look at kind of fun stuff that happened, didn't happen, because as you know, we take photos with our iPhones of just about everything these days. And if I want to make sure and remember something, I'll take a photo of it, and then that'll kind of remind me for the newsletter. But yeah, I'll just go through my photos. I'll go through my calendar, and then I'll go through my Lightroom to see what, business photos I've taken, and kind of bring that all together into a little story and kind of go from there. So, yeah.
Well, we're going to put, for everybody listening in, make sure you take advantage of the show notes, because we're going to put these points in the show notes at bokehpodcast.com, or if you use a podcast player on your phone that includes the show notes in a format that's actually legible. It's weird. Some podcast players in the past the notes are just kind of all over the place. But nonetheless, take advantage of that, including these points. I want to go back before you were sharing those 3 points. So, Gustavo, one of the things that you pointed out was that the email format specifically enables you, or it's the easiest way for you to stay top of mind for your clients. And I want to dig into that just for a second, because I guess maybe 2 different directions I want to go with this. Number one, and I'm curious to get your take on this, Facebook ads are getting ready to change pretty drastically because of some privacy changes that Apple is making to their operating system. Facebook's not going to be able to track our behavior on our phones as readily as they have been because of these changes. And as a result, anybody that wants to run Facebook ads to target potential clients, for example, won't be able to do so as effectively. And this reminds us of the reality, which I think we've kind of all heard at one point or another, that these social media platforms that we leverage for getting new business, we don't own them. Email is something that we, in a sense, own, right? We have the ability to send an email address out from our email address to our email list. And no social media platform that gets shut down or changes their policies is going to control that. Do you see some significance to email specifically for that reason? When you say that it allows you to easily stay on top of your client's mind, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, like that's a great point. All these platforms are going to change, and it's not easy to adapt depending on what you've built on that platform, and it could be gone tomorrow. So you just never know. An email is attached to that person, to that client, probably for quite some time. Typically, if they get promoted, they still have that same email. So for me, I mean, it's going straight to the source too. Something I did mention before was, my client is not necessarily on social much, right? My client is typically, the head of running, the head of marketing or the head of events for, Fortune 500 corporations. So they're pretty busy. So they're not on, getting tagged on Facebook and getting advertised there per se, because they're busy putting on an extremely large event for CEOs and executives.
Right.
So that's why I think, for me, email is key. And I think people should definitely work on gathering more emails from their clients and using that as a tactic as simple as, maybe it's not once a month. I think once a month is perfect because it's not that often. But if you do share a little bit of personal, a little bit of fun, and a little bit of work, I think it's a beautiful combination.
Now, having this email platform, it's something that we own, so there's an advantage to it in that, despite whatever changes might come with social media. But I'm wondering, for me anyway, that the big caveat, if I'm going to play devil's advocate, is that emails have the potential of getting buried with the 500 other emails in that person's inbox. Have you noticed that you've got a pretty high click-through rate, regardless of the fact that everybody's getting hit with an email left and right on a daily basis?
Like I said, it's partly for me when I do send that email out.
Okay.
So one of the things I like to do is not be technical, and I literally do not look at those numbers.
Interesting.
Because once you start looking at those numbers, you start, analyzing it, and then you start getting frustrated. For me, it's going out. If it's a small percent or a large percent that's reading it, great. I enjoy part of the process. I do enjoy part of the process. There is a certain segment that does read it that, I connect with and they respond, and I have that conversation monthly. I'm having conversations with a family member that I see maybe every few years, and it's kind of fun now. Every month we're having that conversation over email. I'm having conversations over email with previous clients from my previous world in pharmaceutical sales that are retired and doing a ton of traveling. So it's always fun to hear from them. I'm having great conversations when I do run into those clients or I do run into those friends on the street, that are kind of up to speed with the newsletter. And I do share it on the social channels too, actually. So it's not like it's just going to the email. I do share it, I share it on LinkedIn. I'll share it on Facebook. I'll share it on Instagram. So I do kind of parse it out and kind of keep people read it in different places. But at the end of the day, I think, it just works.
Huh. That's interesting. Okay. Well, we're going to dig into that in just a little bit to a greater extent, because I'm curious, despite the fact that your focus is the very personal nature of this, both for your own purposes as well as just simply personal connection with the client. Of course, if we're going to put effort, time, and energy, resources in general into doing something for our business, maybe I'm a bit too selfish, but I want to know what the ROI on that is. So we're going to talk about that from your perspective in just a second. But one of the things that's most compelling about your newsletter, as I said, was not just simply the personal nature of it, that you're just sharing personal facts per se, but you're doing so in this really warm storytelling style that just as many emails as I get, and I actually manage my email pretty well, so I don't get as many emails, probably the average person, but as many emails I still get, the likelihood of me to take some time to read a newsletter or a promotional email from a company is not super high. And yet your emails just really draw me in. And if it's all right with you, I want to read just a segment from, I think this is the most recent newsletter that you sent out. Is that all right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. So and to give a little bit more context for those of you listening in, along with this very warm storytelling writing style that Gustavo has, there are these lovely pictures to go along with it. It's almost like you're looking at a magazine article or something. But this is just a segment, and it says, a 2-hour drive southeast put me in the company of a few friends who were gathering for a holiday party. We enjoyed an evening at Wave, an outdoor restaurant set within one beach club. Wave features a modern seat-to-table concept that takes the meanings of fresh, organic, and dining to entirely new levels. What I liked most was the Tulum vibe present within the restaurant. The design included repurposed furniture that strongly complemented the outdoor beachfront. Equally as beautiful was the waterfront apartment my gracious host, Alicia, opened up to me for my stay. I was so inspired by the beauty and balance of the design that I decided to start looking for a similar style of residence for when I return in January to finally settle in. And of course, that's in reference to your recent move to the Miami area, which is super exciting. But I don't know about anybody listening in, but I feel like either I'm reading just a really well-written magazine article or even from a novel. It's just your writing style is awesome. And I'm curious how you've developed that. Like, how do you get to this place where you're able to not just simply share facts, but be able to do so in a way that feels like, I don't know, I want to just go along for the ride.
And I'll give you a secret. I do have a writer.
Do you really?
But I actually write it myself. Okay. So what does the process look like every month? Like I said, I'll go through, kind of my images. I'll go through my calendar. I'll go through, my Lightroom and whatnot. And then I'll take some notes during the month too, kind of on an Evernote. And it's like, oh, this was fun. Maybe talk about this and maybe talk about this. And then I'll actually write the whole newsletter out and sparse it out. And for those that don't know, it's pretty simple. It's 4 sections. One is a section about headshots. One is a section about basically a featured headshot event, featured corporate event. The third section is a story, personal, what's going on in that month. And the last section is something fun. And that's it's called shower thoughts. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah.
But so every month, that's the 4 things I need to add to the newsletter and try to keep it as short as possible. So what I do is I'll write it. I'll write the whole thing. And then I send it out to a writer. I've been working, I guess, 3 years now since I first started.
That's super cool.
She'll polish it. She'll make me sound that amazing, which listening to you read that back to me, I was like, oh, wow, that's pretty impressive, I guess. But no, English is my second language. I'm not an amazing writer. Like I kind of come up with the basics and, put it all together, and she makes me look amazing. So she cleans it up, makes it flow, gets rid of some things, and she sends it back. I even actually kind of tweak some stuff after she sends it back.
Okay.
When she might kind of go a little overboard, I might kind of tone it back if the tone was a little bit off and whatnot. But yeah, no, it's a collaborative effort. I've been working with a writer for, almost 3 years now. And yeah, that's how it sounds and looks so amazing.
I think that's brilliant, though. Okay, so I'm not sure if you're able to share who that individual is, but maybe at the very least, can you share how you were able to go about finding someone to ghostwrite for you?
That is a great question. I'll have to think deep about that. I don't even remember. It might have been through one of my VAs or one of my contacts that referred her. She's in the Atlanta area, and I'll happily send you her information so we can link her on the show notes.
Great.
But yeah, I forget. It's always a referral, typically, for me. So yeah.
Well, I know that, and I'm speaking from personal experience ultimately, and probably largely projecting on our audience, but certainly as I've spent about 20 years in the photography industry and not only written for myself, for my own businesses, but also seen other photographers writing, I think we all struggle, especially as much as we have to write at times, to come up with something that's fresh, that's unique, that will actually draw people in on a regular basis. So the idea that you can just delegate that to somebody else, I think is a brilliant idea. So we'll definitely, for those of you listening in, we're going to try to get that information, put it in the show notes. So by the time this episode comes out, you'll have access to that and to maybe take advantage of that. I think it's really cool. I'm curious though. Oh, go ahead.
Well, let me back up a second. Let's clarify on the delegate. I don't delegate it. So remember, I'm actually writing it.
Okay.
So what she's doing is she's polishing it.
Fair enough. Okay.
She's making me sound amazing, like what you just read, basically.
Interesting.
So, but no, it's definitely not a delegation. I am definitely 100%. I'm 90% of the process, and I have, I'd say I'm 80% of it, and then she does 20% to make it look amazing or make it sound amazing.
Well, it is very obvious that the collaboration is a great one. I think it's brilliant. I'm curious though, when it comes to the sharing, because it is quite personal. What's the line, I guess, between oversharing and compellingly personal? Because as you and I both know, and probably most listening in realize, there's a tendency in social media to, in many cases, overshare to an annoying extent, even in some cases, certainly, where people are airing their dirty laundry and this complaint and that problem and just too much info at times. How do you decide where that line is between oversharing and being personal in a way that actually draws people in?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny because I don't think I've ever thought of the line, right? But, what I would say is we all have struggles. You don't have to share them all, but why not share some? It makes you more human, right? I always talk about bringing the human back into business. People buy from people. So it's, how can you create that connection? So, and then I'm not sharing that much. Like I said before, it's only 4 different sections.
Sure. Actually,
it's only 3 because the 4th one is the fun part, right? So it's not like, and I also like to keep it succinct and keep it a little bit short. So it's not some big drawn out thing. And I also love and every section of that actually has photos. So that's what's also fun. It's a lot of photos and a little bit of text, and hopefully not too much text. I don't know where that line is, right? I just kind of try to keep it fun, try to keep it, some levity to it. And would I share this information with a client? And that's kind of where I draw that line. And typically I have a great relationship with most of these clients. And, again, it's all about relationships at the end of the day. So, they're going to be more committed to you if they know that, you have kids and you're struggling because of COVID, and, they're going to try to help you out, as soon as business comes back, and, all sorts of situations happen that way versus a company that has zero personal connection to that. They're just going to cut off their bottom line. Right.
Yep.
So I think that, that kind of clears it up a little bit.
Yeah, well, I have to say, even as I'm listening to you talk and thinking about our newsletter, it's pretty convicting, honestly, because while certainly I'm trying to juggle multiple brands and we want to grow and scale, at the end of the day, you're right. Like, people want to connect with someone. They want to connect with a big idea, but they'd like to know who's behind that idea or behind those ideas, and connect with someone and feel like they can relate in some way. And again, you've done such a beautiful job of this, but you talked about levity, and there is this section at the end of the newsletter where, I mean, it's literally called Shower Thoughts, I think, right? I mean, you actually pulled some really fun ideas from Reddit. And I'll just read a couple of them here. It's really fun from this particular newsletter. Even though Uber drivers drive a car all day, they walk to work. Or one day soon, there will be kids who have no idea why we associate the sound cha-ching with money. Or crickets are pretty damn loud to be the symbol of silence, which, like, that makes me laugh for sure. Anyway, what's the thought process behind adding this humor? Maybe this is kind of rhetorical in nature, but I'm just curious what your goal was by adding that extra humor to the end of the newsletter.
I get this newsletter that like you said, there's only a few things that I read every day, and this one's called The Hustle. I've been getting the Hustle newsletter for a few years now, and every Friday they have, at the bottom of the email, they have the 5 shower thoughts. Okay. And those actually are pulled from Reddit, which is kind of fun. So over the month, I'll kind of copy and paste those 5 shower thoughts. I'll throw them into an Evernote. And then when I'm putting the newsletter together, I'll kind of pull my 5 favorites out for that month. So that's always a ton of fun. I just want to bring a little bit of balance to the business talk, to the personal talk, and just kind of bring something fun. Like I said, and before, it's like some people just scroll to the bottom and read those and send me their favorite one. Yeah. Or bring it up, the next time you run into them. But I think it's just a great balance to have a little personal, a little business, and then something fun.
Agreed. Yeah, none of us need to take ourselves too seriously at the end of the day. I'm definitely, I told you before we started recording, in the process right now of working on kind of the next step for the Bokeh Podcast. I do have a tendency towards structure. I want to learn to lighten up a little bit more, even with the podcast, as we get into the next phase of our production, potentially add video, maybe even daily shows, this type of thing. And I need to continue to work at, and there's a bit of irony in saying it this way, but I need to continue to work at taking myself less seriously, just to lighten up, to have some fun, to laugh a little bit more. And I love that you highlight that notion at the end of your newsletter. Now, I have to say this, as we kind of finish up our conversation today, I'm really curious to get your take on the glaring omission of any call to action for your clients, potential clients in the newsletter. And I know that you've already highlighted the very personal nature of this newsletter. Do you have any other thoughts to go along with that? Is there any point at which you feel like maybe you do need to include some type of a CTA for the sake of an actual financial ROI with this newsletter?
That was a great question. You sent some of these questions ahead of time, and I was like, I don't think I've ever thought of that. And should I have a call to action? But the first thing that came to mind for me was, my services are not necessarily needed every day. It's being top of mind is kind of the number one goal. It kind of reminds them that I'm there and thinking about them. It's kind of, I don't want to be pounding them over the head with monthly calls to action. And, we see that a lot in a lot of different, emails from different clients or different businesses, or, depending on what you're signed up for. The best example I came up with was like Coca-Cola, right? Like they're not saying, hey, click here, buy Coke, right? They're just saying, hey, we're here. Whenever you're ready to take action, just think of us, right? Buy a Coke. Sort of kind of that same idea. Yep. That's kind of my thought process. Every month I'm reminding my client, I mentioned before that I'm not necessarily working with a lot of these clients all the time. So it might be once or twice or a few times a year, but the other times it's like, hey, here I am. Don't forget about me. When you're ready, come on back, give me a call. And that's sort of the same thought process, I think, as kind of some of those bigger brands that all you see is, it's kind of large billboards per se, but they're not saying, hey, buy Coke, right?
Yeah, it's just about awareness, brand presence.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah,
exactly. It's just that brand recognition, brand awareness. How often are you seeing them, and kind of keep reminding them?
Well, and you're doing it again in just a wonderfully intimate, personal way. I think this is a great way to sum up our conversation. I mean, for those of you listening in, if you're not making the effort, first of all, just on a kind of bigger picture level, to connect with your clients on a more personal level, there's a lot of conversation in the industry about that idea, but I don't know how personal most photographers are getting. It is kind of playing the cliche idea. It is a very, shall we say, culled version of our life that we put out on social media, for example. And I realize, Gustavo, you have similar control with the newsletter as well, but the combination of the imagery, the style of writing, the information that you're sharing, the fact that you do leave that CTA out, that call to action out, just makes me want to hang out with you that much more. And so I think you're doing a beautiful job of your primary goals with this newsletter, and it's a great example for all of our listeners. So thanks for being willing to share about all of this today.
No, yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Grateful for the conversation. Always fun, always learning, and excited to see where the Bokeh Podcast goes.
Remind our listeners too, I know that we've mentioned it in the past episode, but just remind our listeners one more time where they can follow what you're up to, your new adventures in Miami, see your site, follow you on social media. Where can they find all of that?
Yeah, it's pretty much Gustavo Fernandez at most of the handles. Website is GustavoFernandez.com, along with Facebook, Instagram, and Clubhouse now, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and maybe we can do an episode 3 at some point, because I know you and I have had some conversation off air about some of the changes that you're going to be making to particularly your marketing efforts as you're in a new market. It'll be interesting maybe to come back and explore that at a different point to see where you're taking your business, how you've gotten there, how you're getting there. As a result, maybe we can come back and explore that. But everybody listening in, make sure you go follow Gustavo Fernandez on Instagram. And of course, you can find his website as well, as he mentioned, GustavoFernandez.com. We'll put all of this in the show notes at Bokeh Podcast, Bokeh podcast.com. You can also go to BokehBookshelf.com if you're looking for some of the most popular books that we mentioned here on the show. And make sure you check out photographersedit.com as well, producer of the show. If you go to photographersedit.com, that's custom image editing for the professional photographer. Thanks again, Gustavo.
All right. Thank you, Nathan.
Thanks so much, photographers, for listening to the Bokeh Podcast. Will you let us know what you thought of the show by leaving a review of the podcast in the Apple Podcast app? And I'd love to hear from you personally with your thoughts about the podcast and suggestions about future topics and guests for the show. My email is nathan@bokehpodcast.com. Make sure to visit our sponsors, photographersedit.com, custom photo editing for the professional photographer, and miilu.com, that's miilu.com, the simplest way to create and manage timelines and shot lists for the events you're photographing.